"That dog just stole a grocery bag from my porch." I practically shouted the words as I ran to the front window, not quite believing what I was seeing. From my spot in the little living room of my rental in Easton, a sleepy town tucked in Pennsylvania farmland, I saw a mangy golden retriever trotting down the sidewalk, head held high, and clutched tightly in his jaws was a white plastic bag. It bounced against his chest as he moved, flapping gently in the spring wind. The bag had my name on it. Literally. It was one of the meals I'd picked up earlier from Kathy's country kitchen, a to-go box of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans with a slice of cornbread, the kind of meal that sticks to your ribs and warms you all over. I'd set it on the porch while I ran in to grab some napkins. Didn't take more than 20 seconds. But that was long enough for the mystery dog to swoop in and swipe it. "You seeing this, Dale?" I called to my neighbor, who was halfway down the sidewalk pruning the rose bush he babied like it was his grandkid. Dale squinted at the retreating figure. "Is that Max again? Thought animal control got him last month." "No idea, but he's got my lunch." I grabbed my car keys and took off down the front steps, not sure why I cared so much. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I just wanted my meatloaf back. But something about the way that dog carried the bag, careful, not shaking it or tearing it, made me pause. He wasn't running away. He wasn't afraid. He was on a mission. I tailed him through 3 streets, past the post office, and into the back edge of a park where the grass grew wild and the trees stood like silent guards. The dog, golden but dirt-streaked, with a limp on his back leg, finally disappeared behind a cluster of bushes. I crouched and followed quietly. That's when I saw them. 4 tiny pups, little golden fluff balls, all eyes and paws, nestled in a shallow dip under an overturned canoe. They yipped and wiggled as the dog approached. Carefully, gently, he set the plastic bag down, nosed it open, and began nudging bits of mashed potatoes toward the pups. I felt something shift in my chest. He wasn't stealing. He was providing. I backed away slowly, went home, and packed up 2 more meals, one of my frozen lasagnas and a leftover rotisserie chicken. I added a water bowl, some clean rags, and a soft flannel blanket from my garage. Didn't say anything to Dale. Didn't tell anyone. Next day I came back. The food was gone. The pups were curled up on the blanket. The dog, who I now called Rusty, because his coat had a copper sheen under the dirt, sat nearby watching me. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just watched. "You're something else," I whispered, setting down fresh food. "Where's your person, huh?" But he didn't answer. Of course he didn't. So I sat a few feet away, not pushing, just existing beside him. Day after day, I returned. I brought fresh food, dog biscuits, treats from the bakery, toys. One of the pups started toddling toward me, snuffling at my boots. Another tripped and rolled, legs splayed. Rusty always watched, but never interfered. I tried calling the shelter, told them there was a stray with puppies in the park. "We're overwhelmed," the woman on the line said. "Can you bring them in?" But I couldn't. Rusty wouldn't let me close enough, and I wasn't about to break the trust we were slowly building. So I kept showing up. One evening, it rained. Cold sheets of water, wind howling like a freight train. I thought of the pups, of Rusty's limp, and threw on my coat, drove to the park with towels and a big umbrella, sloshed through the mud to find them still huddled under the canoe. Rusty stood over them, soaked to the bone, teeth chattering. That night, I made a decision. I was going to get them out. All of them. I spent the next 2 days prepping. I bought a second-hand crate, lined it with fleece, brought over a big tarp to cover the canoe's leaky edge, got chicken broth, warming pads, and a baby gate. Then I waited. On the third morning, Rusty let me sit closer. He sniffed my knee. I held my breath. "You ready to come home?" He didn't move, but he didn't back away either. It took me 4 days, but I got them all into my truck. The pups came first, bundled in towels and cradled in a laundry basket. Rusty came last. He hesitated at the open crate, then stepped in, head low. I took them home. My house isn't big. It's a 2-bedroom ranch with a tiny kitchen and beige carpeting. But it was warm, clean, safe. The pups explored every corner like it was Disneyland. Rusty sat by the door at first, unsure. Then, after 2 hours, he curled up beside the couch. I took them to the vet the next morning. All 4 pups were healthy, just underfed. Rusty had a sprained leg, some old scarring, and a microchip. But the chip had been deactivated. No owner listed. No one looking. The vet said he was probably dumped. Maybe left behind when someone moved. Maybe tossed out by a backyard breeder. "He's done a good job," the vet said, listening to the pups' little hearts thump-thump. "That's not easy." I nodded, throat tight. Rusty didn't leave the room. He stayed near the pups, always watching. I put up flyers, posted on community boards. No one called, which was just fine by me. I built a pen in my backyard, bought a kiddie pool for them to splash in. Neighbors stopped by to peek through the fence, smiling at the tumbling balls of fluff. One boy, maybe 8 years old, stood for 20 minutes watching Rusty. "He's like a superhero," the kid said. "Yeah," I replied. "He really is." I started documenting their days, videos, little photo updates, shared them online under the name Loving Paws. People started following. Messages came in from all over. Offers to adopt the pups. Donations of food, toys, even vet care. Rusty became a local legend, the dog who carried dinner to his babies. But it wasn't just that. It was how he stood between them and the world. How he always looked twice before relaxing. How he never once barked at me, even when scared. He was cautious, yes, but never mean. That kind of heart? You don't see that every day. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea. Rusty padded over and laid his head on my foot. I didn't move, just sat there, smiling. That was the day I knew. I wasn't just fostering. Rusty was mine, and he had chosen me, too. That was only the beginning of the story. There was still so much more to come. More healing, more surprises, more laughter. But as the sun dipped low and the pups yipped in the grass, I let myself enjoy the moment. After all, the dog who once stole my meatloaf had ended up stealing my heart instead. The first week of having Rusty and the pups in my home felt like controlled chaos. Every time I turned around, one of the puppies had discovered a new way to cause trouble. Unspooled toilet paper, a tipped-over water bowl. One brave explorer who somehow climbed onto the kitchen chair and then couldn't figure out how to get down. Rusty followed behind them like a tired but endlessly patient nanny. I watched him herd the pups away from the bathroom, nudge them away from tangled cords, and occasionally give a quiet huff that somehow made them listen. No barking, no snapping. Just that quiet authority of a dog who'd already seen the world be cruel and wasn't about to let it touch his little ones again. I didn't have kids of my own. Never married. The house had always been too quiet. But now it felt full, noisy, messy, alive. I wasn't sleeping as much, and my evenings were suddenly full of puppy baths and cleaning up shredded paper towels. But I didn't mind. If anything, I felt more grounded than I had in years. That Monday morning, I called in a favor with my boss. I'd been managing a local hardware store for 12 years, and had built up enough goodwill to ask for 2 weeks off without too many questions. Larry, the owner, just said, "Take care of those dogs, Jim. We'll see you when you're ready." I used the time to reinforce the yard fence, add a few more puppy-proof gates inside the house, and set up a quiet corner in the guest room where Rusty could rest without being mobbed by the pups every few minutes. He used it sparingly, always returning to check on them after a short nap. One afternoon, while replacing a torn-up throw pillow, I noticed Rusty staring at the living room window. His ears were perked, and his tail gave one nervous twitch. I walked over and looked out. A white truck sat idling across the street. Not unusual, but something about it felt off. The windows were tinted, and it didn't belong to any of my neighbors. After a minute, it pulled away slowly. I watched it disappear, then glanced back at Rusty. He was still watching the empty spot where it had been. "You recognize that truck, boy?" I asked softly. He didn't move, but the fur on his shoulders was slightly raised. It wasn't the last time I saw that truck. The next few days were calmer. The pups were eating solid food now and beginning to develop distinct personalities. The biggest one, a chunky male I named Tank, was fearless and first to explore anything new. The smallest, a shy little one I named Bean, stuck close to Rusty and whimpered whenever he couldn't see him. People online were starting to ask when the pups would be ready for adoption. The Loving Paws page had grown fast. Local news had even reached out, asking if I'd be willing to do a segment. I politely declined. Rusty still flinched at sudden movements. I didn't want to throw him into the spotlight just yet. Instead, I worked on building up his confidence. I introduced a leash, very slowly. Let him sniff it, chew on it. I never forced anything. Just patience, treats, and quiet moments sitting beside him on the porch. One morning, I left the front door cracked as I brought out the trash. When I turned around, Rusty was standing just beyond the doorway, head up, watching the street. Not running, not panicking, just looking. I smiled. That was progress. That afternoon, the white truck came back. Slower this time. It circled the block twice before parking 2 houses down. My neighbor Dale noticed it too and walked over. "You know those folks?" he asked, nodding toward the vehicle. "Nope, but I've seen it before." A man stepped out. Tall, wiry build, maybe in his late 30s, wore a cap pulled low over his face. He stood beside the truck, scanned the neighborhood, then reached into the bed and pulled out a plastic bag. He set it on the ground, got back in, and drove off. Dale and I walked over slowly. The bag was torn at the top, and inside were pieces of raw chicken and what looked like a few soggy slices of bread. I crouched and poked the edge of the meat with a stick. "Smell that?" Dale asked. I nodded. It was sour. Spoiled. "Somebody's trying to bait him," I muttered. Dale's face darkened. "That ain't right." I disposed of the bag carefully, then set up my old trail cam on the mailbox post. That night, I sat on the porch with Rusty lying beside me. The pups were asleep inside. "You knew that smell," I whispered. "Did someone used to feed you like that? Or were they trying to catch you?" He didn't move, just laid his head on my foot again. The footage from the trail cam confirmed it. The same man returned just after midnight, glanced around, and left another bag. This time it was tied tighter. I saved the footage, sent it to the local animal control. Officer Melanie, a woman I'd met a few times at town events, called me back. "We've had complaints about him," she said. "Name's Roger Carter. He's been reported for illegal breeding and dog dumping before. Never caught him in the act. He's slick." "I think Rusty was one of his," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Keep the footage." And keep that dog safe. If Carter thinks you have something valuable, he might try to take it back. Valuable. Rusty wasn't a thing. He wasn't a product. He was a survivor, a protector, a father. And there was no way I was letting anyone hurt him again. Over the next few days, I kept the house locked tight, moved the pup's play area to the back room, away from windows, started taking Rusty on walks early in the morning through the woods behind the neighborhood where no one else went. One morning, on a narrow trail under the cover of trees, Rusty stopped. He sniffed the ground, then looked up at me. His tail wagged slowly. I followed his gaze. A battered blue dog collar lay half buried in the leaves. I picked it up, brushing off dirt. No tag, just a faded pattern of red bones. "Yours?" I asked. Rusty sniffed it, then turned and walked on. We reached a small clearing, and he sat. Just sat. Like he remembered something, I crouched beside him. "Was this where you escaped? Where he left you?" Rusty looked at me, eyes calm. Whatever happened in that spot, it didn't define him now. He had a new life, a new pack. When we got back home, Tank ran to the door, yipping. Bean toddling behind. Rusty wagged his tail and walked straight to them, letting them pile on. That evening, I sat at the dining table, going through applications. The pups would be ready for homes soon. I had to be careful. Not just anyone would do. One message stood out. A retired firefighter named Tom wanted to adopt 2 together. Had a fenced yard, grandkids who visited, and years of experience with dogs. He'd lost his lab the previous year and had been waiting to find the right match. Another came from a nurse named Evelyn, who lived on a quiet property just outside town. She'd included photos of her home, clean, dog-friendly, full of toys. I scheduled visits, slowly, carefully, but not for Rusty. He wasn't going anywhere. He had already made his choice. That Saturday, I loaded the pups into my truck for their first official playdate with potential adopters. Rusty watched, calm but alert. I kissed his head. "Be back soon, buddy." The visits went well. Tom knelt on the grass and let the 2 most energetic pups tackle him, laughing the whole time. Evelyn sat quietly and let Bean crawl into her lap, his tiny tail wagging like mad. I drove home with a strange ache in my chest. The idea of letting them go was harder than I'd expected. Rusty was waiting at the gate, tail wagging slowly. I opened the back and let the pups tumble out. He sniffed each one, gave a soft woof, then led them back to the yard. The next day, I finalized the first adoption. Tank and his equally wild sister Pebble went to Tom's place. He cried a little when I handed them over. So did I after I got back in the truck. Rusty sat by the fence when I got home. He looked at me, then at the 2 missing pups, then back at me. I crouched beside him. "They're safe," I said. "I promise." He leaned into my side. 2 down, 2 to go. And something told me the next steps were going to be even harder. Not just for the pups, but for Rusty, and for me. Because something was changing. Not just in our little house, but in the quiet streets of Easton. And I had a feeling Carter wasn't done yet. The morning after Tank and Pebble left for their new home, the house felt noticeably quieter. It wasn't bad quiet, just different. Rusty paced the living room a bit more than usual, pausing every so often to sniff the 2 vacant spots on the puppy bed. Bean and the last pup, whom I'd started calling Scout because of how he liked to wander into every nook and cranny, stuck close to Rusty all day. I gave them extra attention, but Rusty didn't seem sad, just watchful, as though keeping track of what was left. It reminded me of old soldiers who'd lost comrades but kept going, staying sharp for the sake of those who remained. He lay in the hallway that night, instead of his usual spot by the back door, positioned so he could see both the bedroom and the pups' crate. 2 days later, I brought Bean to Evelyn's place. The minute we arrived, Bean perked up. He remembered the smell. The place. Evelyn had rearranged her living room since our first visit, setting out new bowls, a soft bed, and toys. She knelt down with tears in her eyes, as Bean crawled into her lap again, like he'd never left. She looked up at me. "He's home." That drive back was the quietest one yet. Scout, alone for the first time, had a hard time settling that evening. He whined at the door and looked around for his siblings. Rusty never left his side. He even climbed into the crate with him for a while, letting Scout curl up against his belly. I sat across the room, watching the scene. And for the first time, I wondered if Rusty had ever been separated from his own litter when he was young. Had he felt this kind of aloneness before? That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about Carter. It had been nearly a week since the last suspicious appearance. Maybe he'd given up. Maybe he didn't know where Rusty was now. Or maybe he was waiting. I checked the trail cam every morning. Nothing. I still kept everything locked tight, and I only walked Rusty in the woods. I brought Scout along in a soft harness, letting him sniff the world from a safe spot. Rusty trotted beside me with a calm I was starting to rely on. One morning, Rusty stopped abruptly near the same clearing where we'd found the collar. He sniffed the air, then turned in a tight circle. He lowered his body and growled. Low, soft, but clear. I crouched beside him and listened. There it was. A faint snapping sound. Twigs underfoot, maybe 30 yards away. I didn't see anyone, but I knew that sound. Someone was nearby. I stood slowly and turned us around. We walked back to the house without rushing. I kept one hand on Rusty's back the whole time, the other clutching the leash. Back at home, I checked the trail cam again. Still nothing. But the feeling stuck with me. That night, I stayed up later than usual, kept the porch light on. Just before midnight, I heard a sound from the backyard. Rusty heard it too, and was on his feet before I could even react. I peered through the curtains. A figure stood near the back fence, tall, wearing a cap. I opened the back door and stepped out with a flashlight. "You don't belong here," I called. "This is private property." The figure didn't move for a second. Then he turned and walked off into the woods. Rusty didn't bark. He stood next to me, tense. That was enough. I called Officer Melanie first thing the next morning. She came by an hour later, inspected the tracks behind the fence, and confirmed what I already suspected. "That was Carter. We'll file a report. You did the right thing. Just keep everything secure." She gave me her personal number. "If he comes back, don't confront him. Call me. We're building a case. We'll get him." Scout seemed to sense the tension. He stayed closer to me and to Rusty, less bold than before. I thought about holding off on the last adoption. Just for a while. But then came the letter. Folded neatly. No envelope. Left on my porch. "You took what's mine. You think he's special, but he's just a dog. I made him. He remembers. And I'll be back for what's mine." No signature. Just those cold, printed words. I handed it to Melanie. She bagged it for prints. That night I sat on the porch again, flashlight and phone beside me. Rusty sat at my feet. He looked out into the dark and gave one soft, steady woof. I placed a hand on his head. "Not on my watch, boy. Not ever again." 2 days later, Melanie called. They had linked Carter to 3 illegal operations across county lines. She didn't give me details, but her voice sounded more hopeful. "We're close," she said. "Stay sharp a little longer." I stayed sharp, but I also let myself enjoy the moments in between. Scout had started playing fetch, sort of. He chased the ball, picked it up, and immediately ran the opposite direction. Rusty would chase him down, gently take it from his mouth, and bring it back to me like he was doing damage control. Those afternoons reminded me why I was doing this, why I'd changed my entire routine for these dogs. Love does that to you, shifts your priorities. Then came the break-in. It was a Tuesday, just after noon. I'd gone out for groceries, maybe 15 minutes tops. When I came back, the front door was cracked open. My heart dropped. I rushed inside, calling, "Rusty, Scout!" Rusty appeared from the hallway, barking sharply. I heard a crash from the back. I ran through the house and saw a figure leaping the back fence. I chased but couldn't catch him. Rusty stayed behind with Scout, who was curled in the corner, trembling. They were safe. Shaken, but safe. Melanie arrived within the hour. She examined the door, took prints, and this time, they found something. Real evidence. "He's slipping," she said. "He's getting reckless. That's good for us." I wasn't sure how good it felt. That night, I bolted the doors, turned on every light, and let Rusty sleep in my room. Scout nestled between us, finally falling asleep after an hour of restless pacing. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I received another message from Evelyn. Bean was doing great. She'd attached a video of him frolicking in a patch of daffodils, his tail wagging like a metronome. She wrote, "Thank you for trusting me with him. He's brought so much light into my home." I watched the video 3 times, heart swelling. Later that day, Tom sent a picture of Tank and Pebble sprawled on a couch, fast asleep, each with a kid tucked beside them. I realized then that Carter hadn't just tried to steal Rusty back. He'd tried to steal the future those pups never would have had if Rusty hadn't carried that plastic bag. That plastic bag, my meatloaf dinner. I still smiled every time I thought about it. And now, here we were. Scout had grown, filled out. He was ready. I'd been holding back, unsure. But the way he played, the way he looked at the world now, not with fear but with curiosity. That was Rusty's doing. Rusty had made him brave. So I reached back out to Evelyn. "Would you consider adding one more? Bean's brother. He's ready." She wrote back instantly. "Absolutely. He'd be more than welcome." I scheduled the visit, told Scout the news like he could understand. Maybe he did. He wagged his tail and barked, then ran to find Rusty. The 2 of them wrestled for an hour that night like it was a celebration. I packed his things the next morning. Rusty rode with us in the truck. I figured it was only right. He'd started this journey. He should see it through. Evelyn's place looked like something out of a magazine. Sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the scent of fresh bread in the air. Bean ran to greet us at the door. Scout took one look at him and barked. The reunion was full of tail wags and yips. Rusty stood still, watching, then stepped forward and licked each of them once before turning back to me. We didn't linger. On the drive home, I reached over and scratched behind his ears. "They're safe. All of them. You did it." Rusty rested his head on the seat, eyes closing. I could almost hear his sigh, but deep inside I knew it wasn't over. Carter was still out there, and I had a feeling the final confrontation was coming sooner than I'd like. Rusty and I had one more chapter to face together, and this time we'd be ready. The night after Scout joined his brother and Evelyn, I sat on the couch with Rusty beside me. the quiet filling the corners of the house like a warm blanket. The puppies were all gone now, each in a safe, loving home. The house felt emptier, yes, but it didn't feel lonely. Rusty and I had gone through something together. That kind of bond settles in deep, stronger than anything words can capture. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Rusty remained alert, more so than usual. His ears twitched at every creak of the house, every shifting shadow outside. He took to sleeping near the door again, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but never fully closed. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed and had a bat leaning next to the front door, just in case. The police patrols passed more frequently now, a quiet acknowledgement that they were watching. Officer Melanie checked in twice that week, driving slowly past the house and offering a wave when she caught me out front. She assured me they were closing in on Carter, just a matter of time. I appreciated the updates, but I didn't relax. Not yet. That Friday, I drove out to the farm supply store to pick up more dog food and a few odds and ends. When I returned, there was a package on my porch. No address, no return label, just a plain brown box with my name written in thick black marker. Rusty stood beside me, stiff as a board. His nose twitched. I didn't touch it. Called Melanie immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later with another officer. They inspected the box and opened it carefully. Inside was a single dog collar, not new. Worn, frayed, and darkened with age. A scrap of paper was taped to the buckle. "You owe me." Melanie's jaw clenched. "He's trying to rattle you." "It's working," I admitted. She didn't argue. "We've got an officer in an unmarked car posted at the end of the street. He won't get near your house without us knowing. Just hang tight." Rusty sniffed the collar again that night. Then, without hesitation, he walked to the back door and let out a single bark. He was ready. I could feel it. We resumed our morning walks, but now I carried a can of dog spray and a walking stick. We stuck to the deeper trails in the woods, paths less traveled. Rusty led the way with his tail held high, his limp barely noticeable. Then, 2 days later, we found the van. It was parked deep in the trees, hidden off an old hunting path. Rusty stopped cold the moment we spotted it, his body lowering to the ground. I crouched beside him and took a good look. The van was old and beat up, with its windows covered in aluminum foil. The rear bumper was dented, and one tire looked soft. I memorized the plates, snapped a photo with my phone, and we backed away. Back at the house, I sent the plate number to Melanie. Her reply came fast. "That's one of his. We'll take it from here." But it wasn't over. The next morning, my truck wouldn't start. I popped the hood and found the battery gone. Just gone. Wires clipped clean. I checked the garage. Nothing else missing. Just the battery. Rusty growled at the open garage door, tail stiff. I borrowed Dale's truck and drove to the station to file a report. When I returned, another note was waiting for me, taped to the back gate. "Don't play dumb. You know what he is?" That night, I brought Rusty inside and let him sleep in the bedroom again. I installed another motion-activated light near the garage and mounted a second trail cam near the back fence. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours. Rusty didn't either. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. I got calls from all 3 adopters. Tank and Pebble were thriving with Tom and his family. Bean and Scout were practically joined at the hip at Evelyn's place. Hearing their updates helped, but I still checked every window before bed and jumped at every unexpected noise. Then, just when I thought the tension might ease, it happened. It was around 3 in the morning when Rusty launched off the floor with a snarl. He ran to the back door, barking with a voice I'd never heard from him before, low, guttural, and sharp. The security light outside flashed on. I followed with the bat in one hand, heart racing. When I reached the door, I saw him. Carter. He was standing just beyond the fence, flashlight in hand, a sack slung over one shoulder. He froze when he saw me, then turned and bolted. Rusty lunged against the door. "No," I said, "not yet." I grabbed my phone and called Melanie. This time, they caught him. He didn't get far, just down the hill and halfway into the woods. The unmarked car caught him trying to ditch the sack, which was full of collars. Old, used, many with names still stitched into them. Names that didn't match any dog I knew. Melanie called me the next morning. "We got him, and thanks to the collars and some recovered records, he's facing multiple charges: animal cruelty, illegal breeding, abandonment." I sat down on the porch steps, Rusty at my side. "What happens next?" "Court date, investigation, but he won't be bothering you anymore." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Rusty nudged my arm. That night, I slept with both windows open. The breeze was cool, and the night sounds didn't feel threatening anymore. Rusty stretched out beside the bed, fully relaxed for the first time in weeks. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the trail more often. Rusty still led the way, though he walked a bit slower now, stopping to sniff trees and stare out at the creek. I brought a thermos of coffee sometimes and sat on the hill while Rusty wandered within eyesight. I found peace there. And I started writing again, just small things, stories, memories, lessons I never knew I'd learned until Rusty came into my life. And I began to think about what came next, not with fear, but with clarity. Not the end, just the next part. Rusty had always been quiet, but now that the threat was gone, something deeper settled into him. A peace I hadn't seen before. He still stood guard at the window sometimes, but the tension was gone from his shoulders. He didn't flinch at car doors slamming or bark at shadows anymore. He simply observed, watched, thought. Sometimes I wondered what memories played behind those eyes. I noticed the difference in myself, too. I wasn't jumping at every noise or sleeping with the hallway lights on. I stopped checking the locks more than once. My steps felt lighter. The worry I'd carried like a weight had begun to lift, slowly but surely. Still, I wasn't quite ready to return to routine. Larry, my boss at the hardware store, had been understanding through it all. When I stopped by for a visit, he clapped me on the back and said, "Take another week. We've got it handled." I didn't argue. Instead, I took that week to reconnect with the world outside my yard. The local elementary school had invited me to speak after the story of Rusty and the pups made its rounds in the community. They'd read about it on the Loving Paws page and wanted me to share the story with the second grade class. I was hesitant at first. I didn't know what I could offer a room full of kids. But then I thought of Rusty, of the way he watched over those pups, the lessons he'd taught me without ever speaking a word. So I said yes. When we walked into the school library that Friday morning, Rusty at my side on a leash he barely needed anymore, the kids gasped in unison. One little boy clapped his hands over his mouth and whispered, "It's him! It's really him!" I told them the story as best I could, about the meal he'd taken from my porch, the puppies under the canoe, the quiet courage of a dog who refused to give up on his family. Rusty lay calmly at my feet the entire time, letting the children take turns petting his head afterward. One little girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth said, "He's like a superhero dog." I smiled. Yeah, he really is. Back at home, I started thinking more seriously about the future of Loving Paws. What had started as a few online updates had grown into something people were genuinely invested in. Folks kept messaging, asking how they could help. Some wanted to donate supplies. Others asked if I'd consider rescuing more dogs. I wasn't sure what that meant yet. I didn't see myself opening a full shelter. I didn't have the space, the time, or the energy to do it right. But maybe there was something in between. I started sketching out ideas, a temporary foster setup, partnerships with local vets and shelters, a system for matching stray dogs with safe homes, something built on the trust and patience Rusty had shown me. The first step was setting up a proper website. I called it Loving Paws Haven. Clean design, photos of Rusty and the pups, a story tab, a foster application form, a wish list for supplies. Nothing fancy, just real, honest content. Rusty's story brought people in, but it was his quiet resilience that kept them engaged. He was more than a symbol. He was proof that healing was possible. That even when life tosses you out like trash, someone out there might see your worth and help you stand back up. One afternoon, while uploading a new batch of photos, Rusty chasing leaves in the yard, a pup update from Evelyn, I heard tires crunching on gravel out front. A woman stepped out of a modest sedan. She looked to be in her 60s, with white blonde hair pulled into a bun and sharp blue eyes that scanned the yard. I stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" She held up a paper printout. "You're the man with the dog, Rusty." I nodded slowly. "That's me." She walked forward, a little stiff in her movements. "My name's Judith. I think I knew him before." I looked down at Rusty, who had come to stand beside me. His ears perked up, tail still. Judith crouched slightly, staying at a respectful distance. "He came from my neighbor's place, Roger Carter. I lived next door for years. I'd see the dogs through the fence, heard them crying at night." I swallowed. "You knew what he was doing?" "I suspected," she said quietly. "I reported it once. Nothing came of it. Then I moved, couldn't take it anymore. But I always wondered about the dogs, especially the golden one." Rusty walked forward slowly. Judith held out her hand. He sniffed her fingers. Then, to my surprise, he licked them. She smiled. "You made it out. You did good." We talked for a while on the porch. Judith told me about the constant barking, the smell from Carter's yard, the times she'd seen him shove dogs into crates. "I wish I'd done more," she said. "But I'm glad someone finally did." After she left, I sat beside Rusty on the porch steps. "You were already special back then, huh?" He laid his head on my knee. That night, I received a message from Tom. Tank and Pebble had passed their first obedience class. He attached a video of them sitting proudly while the instructor handed him a certificate with both their names scribbled in childish handwriting. I shared the video on the Loving Paws page, and within an hour, it had over 1,000 likes. Rusty was curled up by the fireplace as I worked. He raised his head when I laughed at one of the comments. I snapped a photo of him then, just him and the firelight, and added it to the post. "Still watching over his pups from afar," I wrote. A few days later, I took Rusty to visit the vet. Just a checkup, but I wanted to be sure. His limp had flared up a little again, and I didn't want to risk ignoring it. The vet, Dr. Warren, greeted Rusty like an old friend. "He looks good," he said after the exam. "But we'll keep an eye on that leg. It might need some therapy down the line. Age and old injuries catch up eventually." Rusty didn't seem bothered. He licked Dr. Warren's face and trotted back to my side like nothing had happened. "You ever think about training him as a therapy dog?" Dr. Warren asked. I hadn't, but the idea stuck with me all the way home. Rusty had a calm about him, a steady presence, the kind that made people feel safe. Maybe he wasn't just healing from his past. Maybe he could help others do the same. I started looking into local programs. It wouldn't be easy, not with his history, his injuries. But I wasn't thinking about trophies or certifications. I was thinking about the veterans' home 2 towns over, the children's hospital, the lonely people who could use a quiet companion who just knew how to sit beside you and understand. Rusty didn't need to pass any test to be special. But maybe we could try. Over the next few weeks, I started introducing him to new environments. Quiet visits to the farmer's market, slow walks through the town square, brief stops outside the library where kids read to therapy animals once a month. Everywhere we went, people noticed him. Is that the dog from the news? Is that Rusty? That's the one who saved those puppies, right? I'd nod, and Rusty would sit calmly, tail wagging once or twice as people came over. He didn't bark, didn't flinch, just let them see him. And somehow, in that silence, he told his story better than I ever could. I hadn't planned on becoming someone known in town. I'd always been the quiet guy at the hardware store, the one who fixed things and didn't say much. But now, folks waved when I passed. Kids pointed and smiled. Strangers left notes on my porch. Thank you cards, hand-drawn pictures, even dog treats wrapped in ribbons. One woman sent a letter that read, "Seeing Rusty's story helped me get out of a bad situation. If a dog can fight for his life and his family, maybe I can too." I read that one 3 times before setting it gently on the mantel. Rusty looked up at me like he understood. Maybe he did. He'd once been just a stray with a plastic bag in his mouth. But now he was something more. And I had a feeling we were just getting started. The first time Rusty visited the Veterans Center, he stood at the doorway for a full minute, ears up, tail still. I held the leash loosely and didn't say a word. He was taking it all in, the steady hum of conversation, the shuffle of boots on tile, the faint scent of disinfectant and old leather. It wasn't fear I saw in his posture. It was caution, like he was remembering something he couldn't quite place. Then a man in a wheelchair rolled up slowly, stopping just a few feet from us. His hair was gray, his face lined but kind. "Well, you must be the famous Rusty," he said softly. Rusty sniffed the air once, then walked forward, steady and calm. He rested his head on the man's knee. That's how it started. I didn't know what to expect when I signed us up. I'd talked to the director, filled out the forms, explained that Rusty wasn't certified through any official therapy program yet. She said, "Let's just see how he does. Sometimes presence is enough." It was. The Veterans Center became part of our weekly routine. Every Tuesday morning, we made the drive out, me with a coffee in hand, Rusty with his head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. We didn't stay long, usually an hour or 2, just long enough for Rusty to make his rounds. He had a way of knowing who needed him the most. Some folks lit up when they saw him. Others stayed quiet, letting him sit beside them while they stared at nothing in particular. One man, Gary, barely spoke the first 3 visits, but on the 4th, he reached out a trembling hand and touched Rusty's head. "Had one like him once," he whispered. Rusty didn't move, just stayed there, tail thumping once. Gary smiled. Good boy. Those words cracked something open. From then on, Gary talked a little more each week. About the dog he'd had back in Texas. About the days when silence had felt like safety. Rusty didn't need to understand the words. He was there. And that was enough. Back home, Things were quieter now. No more pups wrestling in the hall, no more threats lurking around the fence line. The routine was simple. Morning walks, an afternoon nap for Rusty and his favorite patch of sun, evenings on the porch. But the simplicity wasn't empty. It was full, layered with meaning in the way the days folded into each other. Neighbors stopped by more often. Dale brought over a new chew toy shaped like a hamburger. Rusty carried it around the yard like a trophy. Miss Carol from down the block knitted a scarf in Rusty's color, a rich golden brown, and dropped it off with a plate of lemon cookies. "You tell that boy he's loved," she said, eyes misting. I updated the Loving Paws site with a new section. Rusty's Journal. Just little updates, reflections, moments from our visits and everyday life. People loved it. One entry about Rusty sitting by a pond and watching ducks for half an hour got hundreds of comments. One man wrote, "Your posts are the only thing that gets me through the week. Thank you." Another said, "I showed your story to my son. He wants to volunteer at the shelter now." I wasn't trying to be an inspiration. I was just writing about a dog who had saved me as much as I'd saved him. But I started to see that maybe sharing our story mattered. It was early spring when I received the invitation to speak at the Regional Animal Welfare Conference in Harrisburg. A woman named Leah had been following the Loving Paws page and thought Rusty's story could help others in the rescue world. "I know you're not a shelter or a formal rescue," she wrote, "but what you did, what Rusty did, embodies everything we stand for." Public speaking had never been my thing, but something inside me said yes before I had time to overthink it. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing, writing, and rewriting, trying to find the right words to explain how a stray with a limp and a plastic bag full of meatloaf changed my life. Rusty watched me pace the living room, tail thumping every time I paused to look at him. He had no idea what I was working on, but he seemed to know it mattered. When the day came, I put on a collared shirt and packed a duffel bag with Rusty's blanket, treats, water bowl, and the hamburger toy. The drive to Harrisburg took 2 hours. Rusty slept most of the way. The conference center was bigger than I expected. Rows of booths, presentation halls, dozens of people in matching shirts or name tags. I checked in, got my schedule, and found our designated area. I had 20 minutes. I wasn't nervous until the lights dimmed, and I stepped onto the small stage with Rusty at my side. Then I saw the crowd, maybe 100 people, all watching. Some with notebooks, some with tears already forming. I cleared my throat. "My name is Jim, and this is Rusty." He sat beside me like a statue. I told the story from the beginning. The meatloaf, the pups, the plastic bag, the hiding place under the canoe. I talked about trust, how it can be broken, rebuilt, and reimagined. I talked about how healing doesn't come fast, but it does come. And I ended with this. Rusty didn't just save those puppies. He reminded me that even when things seem hopeless, there's always something worth saving. Sometimes that something saves you right back. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then came the applause. Afterward, people came up in groups to meet us. Some asked questions. Others just knelt down and pet Rusty, whispering to him like he could understand the weight they carried. One man, who introduced himself as the director of a trauma recovery center, asked if I'd consider letting Rusty visit his facility. "We have veterans, survivors, people who've seen darkness. I think he could help." I told him we'd think about it. The ride home felt lighter, not because we were done, but because something had shifted. Rusty wasn't just my dog. He was becoming a bridge, connecting stories, opening hearts. Later that week, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, just a small card, handwritten. Thank you for letting Rusty live a life of purpose. I couldn't give him that, but I see now that someone could. The handwriting looked familiar. Judith. I kept the card in a drawer, not to revisit pain, but to remember that sometimes redemption comes in small, quiet ways. As spring deepened, the yard bloomed with new life. I planted marigolds by the fence and added a small wooden sign near the porch. Loving Paws Haven. Rusty had his own bed on the porch now, a soft cushion with his name stitched into the corner. He lay there most evenings, watching the sun dip below the trees. Sometimes kids would ride by on their bikes and wave. Rusty would lift his head and give a single wag. We had started working with a trainer named Carl, a former police dog handler who volunteered his time with potential therapy animals. Carl came by twice a week, offering simple exercises, focused walking, gentle commands, noise exposure. Rusty took to it with quiet confidence. Not flashy, not perfect, but present. Carl said, "He doesn't need to be perfect. He just needs to be who he is." And that was more than enough. We added another stop to our visits, the children's hospital in the next town over. I wasn't sure how Rusty would handle the bright lights, the machines, the unpredictable energy of kids. But the moment we stepped into that first room and a child reached out with a cautious hand, Rusty melted into calm. One little boy, no older than 6, whispered, "He feels safe." Rusty leaned his weight against the bed frame, staying there until the boy fell asleep. That night, I wrote another entry for Rusty's journal. He's not just my dog anymore. He's everyone's. I meant it. What had started as a stray with a plastic bag had become a movement. Not flashy, not loud, but steady, like Rusty. And though I didn't know what was ahead, I knew one thing for certain. Wherever we went next, we were going together. Rusty's growing presence in the community had this strange, quiet ripple effect I didn't expect. It wasn't just the kids at the hospital or the veterans at the center anymore. Word had spread. People were beginning to call, not for interviews or publicity, but for help. A woman from a nearby town reached out through the Loving Paws site. Her name was Susan, and her teenage son had been isolating after the loss of their family dog. She didn't ask for much. Just a visit, maybe. "He doesn't talk to many people," she wrote. "But he used to talk to Max." I read the message twice, then looked over at Rusty. He was lying on the porch, eyes half closed, enjoying the late afternoon sun. When I walked outside, he raised his head and gave a single wag of his tail. "You feel up for a trip?" Susan's house was about 30 minutes out, tucked on the edge of a long gravel road with tall maples lining the driveway. She met us at the front porch, thanked me twice, then led us through the living room to where her son, Jake, sat cross-legged on the floor with a book in his lap. Jake didn't look up right away. He was maybe 15, thin, pale, wearing a hoodie despite the warm day. Susan crouched beside him. "Jake, this is Jim, and this is Rusty." Still no response. I didn't push it. I just knelt a few feet away and let Rusty take the lead. He approached slowly, then sat beside Jake, not demanding attention, just existing beside him. 5 minutes passed, then 10. And then Jake reached out and touched Rusty's back. Not a pet, just contact. Rusty didn't move, didn't react, except for a soft thump of his tail. Another few minutes, and Jake whispered something I couldn't quite catch. Susan turned to me, tears in her eyes. "That's the first thing he said out loud in 3 weeks." We stayed another hour. Jake eventually rested his hand on Rusty's shoulder like an anchor. No questions, no pressure, just quiet healing. On the way home, I rolled down the window and let the wind move through the truck. Rusty stood with his front paws on the door, tongue out, watching the world go by. "You really are something else," I said. The next week brought another message, this time from a local teacher named Greg who ran a special education program. He'd read about Rusty's visits to the hospital and wanted to know if we'd come by the school sometime, just for a short while. "Meet the kids. Say hi." I said yes. The school was a small brick building nestled behind an old baseball field. When we arrived, the class was already waiting outside, sitting in a circle on a patch of grass. Greg introduced us, and I let Rusty wander. He moved from child to child, pausing to sniff their shoes, letting them touch his ears, his back, his side. One boy clapped and shouted with joy. A girl sat very still, watching closely, then held out a toy dog from her backpack. Rusty gently sniffed it and gave her hand a lick. The children laughed. Greg later told me it was the first time some of them had smiled in weeks. Rusty didn't know he was doing anything special. To him, it was just another walk, another group of humans to sit beside. But something about his presence, the calm, the stillness, opened something in people. Back home, I noticed he was sleeping a little deeper these days. The kind of rest that comes when you're not just tired, but fulfilled. He'd earned it. But we weren't done. Melanie called again. Not about Carter, he was still awaiting trial and out of our lives, but about another dog. "We picked up a stray yesterday," she said. "Golden Retriever mix. Male. Limp on his back leg, just like Rusty. Thought you should know." Something in her voice made me pause. "You think they're related?" She hesitated. "Might be. He's younger, skittish, won't let anyone near him, but he reacts to Rusty's name." I didn't wait. I grabbed Rusty's leash and got in the truck. The shelter was only 10 minutes away. When we arrived, Melanie met us at the back entrance and led us into the intake wing. "He's in the last kennel," she said. "Hasn't eaten much. Growls when we get too close." We walked slowly down the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The dog was curled up in the far corner of the kennel, ribs showing through a patchy coat. His eyes were wide, alert, filled with fear. Rusty stopped a few feet from the bars and lay down. The dog looked up. For a full minute, they just stared at each other. Then the younger dog stood, limped forward, and pressed his nose to the bars. Rusty didn't move. I looked at Melanie. "Open it." She hesitated. "You sure?" I nodded. "He's not alone now." The kennel door creaked open. Rusty stayed put. The younger dog stepped forward slowly, inch by inch, until their noses touched. Then, almost shyly, he licked Rusty's face. Rusty let out a low, contented chuff. I didn't know if they were related, siblings, offspring, packmates, but it didn't matter. They knew each other. We brought him home that evening. I named him Shadow, partly because of his coat, but mostly because of how he followed Rusty from room to room. Everywhere Rusty went, Shadow was 2 steps behind. At first, Shadow didn't eat unless Rusty didn't sleep unless Rusty curled up beside him. I set up a second bed near the fireplace, but more often than not, they shared one. The neighbors came by to meet him, dropping off treats and squeaky toys. Dale stood at the gate and said, Looks like Rusty's got himself a little brother. I wasn't sure how permanent Shadow's stay would be. I told myself it was temporary, just until he got stronger. But Rusty had already made the decision. Every time someone new came by, he stood in front of Shadow. Not aggressive, just protective. "This one's mine," he seemed to say. So we became a trio. Walks took a little longer with Shadow learning the ropes, but Rusty didn't mind. He slowed down, gave him space to sniff, even nudged him forward when he hesitated at corners. I updated the website with a new post. Rusty's not the only one anymore. The response was overwhelming. People sent messages of encouragement, photos of their own adopted dogs, stories about the animals that had saved them. Donations poured in again, enough to restock supplies, build a second outdoor pen, and even cover vet bills for Shadow's treatment. He needed work. His leg was worse than Rusty's had been, and the vet suspected nerve damage, but we'd deal with that one step at a time. Shadow learned quickly. He wasn't as calm as Rusty, more reactive, jumpier, but he was trying. And when he lay beside Rusty and mimicked his stillness, I saw it. The same spark that had once glowed in Rusty's eyes, just waiting for a chance. I took them both to the Veterans Center the following week. Shadow was hesitant, clinging close to Rusty, tail tucked. But one of the residents, an old Navy man named Richard, reached out with a steady hand. "It's all right, buddy," he said. "You're safe here." Shadow inched closer. Then, without warning, he placed his paw on Richard's foot and looked up at him. Richard smiled. "Just like your brother, huh?" Rusty watched from a few feet away, tail wagging. That night, both dogs fell asleep on the porch under the stars. I sat beside them, a blanket draped over my shoulders, coffee in hand. Whatever this was becoming, this quiet movement, this haven we were building, I knew it wasn't just about rescue anymore. It was about showing the world what love looked like when it was given freely, when it asked nothing in return. Rusty had started it. Shadow was continuing it. And we weren't done yet. The mornings had a rhythm now, one I hadn't realized I'd come to rely on until it was there waiting each day. Rusty was always the first to stretch and yawn, rising from his bed with a slow, regal kind of motion, like an old soul greeting the world once more. Shadow, now 2 months into his new life with us, still took cues from him. He'd wait until Rusty moved before following, stretching his limbs like a pup despite the healing injury in his hind leg. Together we'd step into the soft light of early day, the sky barely touched with color. Rusty would make his lap around the yard with practiced purpose, tail swishing in lazy arcs, while Shadow darted around him like a satellite, always just close enough not to get lost. I drank my coffee on the porch, watching them both. These days, it felt like I was learning from them more than they were from me. The therapy work continued, only now it was with 2 dogs, not 1. We were cautious with Shadow, mindful of his skittishness. But he surprised us. He seemed to come alive around people, not all, but some, kids especially. Maybe it was something about their openness, their lack of judgment. Maybe he recognized something in their energy that reminded him of the kindness he had missed for so long. It was during one of our school visits that something new happened. We'd just finished a session with Greg's special education class. The kids were settled on a rug in the reading corner, some tracing their fingers along Rusty's back, others giggling as Shadow slowly crept closer, still cautious but more curious each time. Greg leaned over to me and said, "You ever think about starting a reading program? We've got a few kids who only feel comfortable reading aloud when your boys are here." I blinked. "Reading program?" He nodded. "Yeah, kids read to the dogs. No pressure, no judgment. It helps with fluency, confidence. You could start with us, see how it goes." I looked over at the kids, one of whom was now holding a picture book open in front of Rusty. Rusty, in turn, stared at the page like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. "All right," I said. "Let's try it." We called it Paws and Pages. Every Thursday afternoon, Rusty and Shadow joined a rotating group of elementary school students for 20-minute reading sessions. The results were almost immediate. Kids who'd struggled with stammering started speaking more smoothly. A few who avoided reading altogether began signing up for extra slots. One little boy, Jordan, who had barely spoken above a whisper all year, read an entire chapter book to Shadow over 3 visits. The impact was real. I shared the idea on the Loving Paws site, and within a week, 3 other schools reached out, asking if we could bring the program to them too. I was careful not to overcommit. Rusty was older now, and Shadow was still learning. But we did what we could. Meanwhile, at home, the quiet expanded in a good way. Rusty had started sleeping deeper. Not from age or illness, just peace. The kind of peace you only earn after giving everything and finally being able to rest without looking over your shoulder. Shadow had his moments, spooked by the occasional sound or movement, but those moments were becoming fewer. He began barking at squirrels, which I took as a good sign. He played tug-of-war with Dale's dog through the fence. He nuzzled visitors, and sometimes even wagged his tail in that wild, uneven way dogs do when they haven't quite mastered joy but are close. Then one day, a storm rolled through. It came without much warning, just a sudden wall of wind and rain slamming against the house. I was in the kitchen when I heard a sharp bark. Rusty was already at the back door, staring out at the yard. Shadow was nowhere to be seen. I found him under the bed, trembling. I crouched down and called softly. "Hey, it's okay. Just a storm." Rusty came over and lay down beside me. That's when Shadow crawled forward, inch by inch, until he was tucked between us. I let them stay there for as long as the thunder lasted. It reminded me how deep trauma could root itself. Shadow still carried echoes of the past, the same way Rusty once had. But the difference now was, he wasn't facing it alone. That weekend, we held a community event at the park. Not a big production, just something small. A tent, some folding chairs, a table with baked goods. People brought their dogs, shared stories, asked questions. I talked about fostering, about trust, about second chances. Rusty and Shadow sat in the shade, greeting everyone who came near. Kids fed them bits of apple slices and crusts from peanut butter sandwiches. One girl gave Shadow a bracelet made of yarn. He wore it for the rest of the day. Tom came with Tank and Pebble. Evelyn brought Bean and Scout. The reunion was something else. 5 grown dogs tumbling together like they were still puppies. Rusty sat a few feet away, watching with that same look of quiet satisfaction he always had. He didn't need to join in. He just needed to see them happy. Later that afternoon, a man approached me. Late 30s, plaid shirt, nervous energy. "You're the guy with the dog from the news?" I nodded. "That's Rusty." He looked over at Shadow. "And that one?" "Newer addition. Name's Shadow." The man shifted his weight. "I've got a place. Few acres out near the river. Used to raise dogs. Not like Carter did. Good dogs. But after my wife passed, I let it all go." I didn't say anything, just listened. He looked down. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to try again. Foster? Or volunteer? Something." I nodded slowly. "There's always room to start again." He left with a brochure and a promise to follow up. I hoped he would. That night, back at the house, I updated the site with a new entry. Rain, reading, redirection. I wrote about the storm, about Shadow under the bed, about the park, and I ended with this. Not every rescue is dramatic. Sometimes it's just standing in the rain beside someone who's still afraid of thunder. And not leaving. The response was overwhelming again. Teachers asking about paws and pages, therapists requesting visits, a retired couple offering to host a monthly support circle for foster volunteers. The ripple kept growing. Rusty still slept on the porch most nights, head resting on the step, eyes half closed. Shadow started joining him there, curling up in a smaller spiral beside him. Some evenings I'd sit out with them, blanket on my lap, coffee gone cold. The house didn't feel too quiet anymore. It felt ready. Ready for what, I wasn't sure, but I knew we'd figure it out, together. We figured it out slowly, in the way you do when there's no map, just moments that feel right. Some days that meant saying yes to a classroom invitation. Other days it meant spending the afternoon in the backyard, watching birds while Rusty and Shadow snoozed in the grass. The world didn't demand big answers. It asked only for presence. And in that, we found purpose. Rusty continued to lead, even as his steps grew more deliberate. His leg, the one that had first revealed itself in a careful limp so long ago, now stiffened more than it used to. I helped him into the truck instead of watching him leap. He didn't complain. He simply adapted, the way he always had. He still wanted to go places, be near people, show up. And every time I saw a hand rest gently on his head, or a quiet voice whisper into his ear, I knew why he kept going. Shadow took more initiative now. He greeted visitors at the gate, barked when the mail truck came, and nuzzled into laps without waiting for permission. He'd found his confidence in Rusty's shadow, and now he was stepping forward into his own light. The Paws and Pages program expanded to 5 schools. I trained a few local volunteers to manage sessions when we couldn't attend. One woman named Claire, a former librarian who'd lost her job during the pandemic, cried the first time she watched a child read to Shadow. "It's like they're healing each other," she said, and I couldn't disagree. The Loving Paws Haven website turned into more than a blog. It became a landing place for those who needed hope. I added resources for foster parents, stories from volunteers, links to shelters in surrounding counties. People started submitting their own tales, rescues and redemptions, struggles and triumphs. I posted every one. Then, on a quiet Tuesday, I woke up before sunrise and found Rusty still asleep. He usually met me at the bedroom door, tail wagging gently, ready for the morning ritual. But today, he stayed curled in his bed by the fireplace, his breathing steady, peaceful. I knelt beside him and whispered, "Take your time." He opened his eyes slowly, lifted his head, and gave one soft, slow wag. I sat with him for a while, hand resting on his side. That day, we didn't go anywhere. I canceled our school visit and let the world spin without us. We stayed in the yard, under the wide blue sky. Shadow lay close, sensing something in Rusty's stillness. The next morning was much the same. Rusty ate a little, drank water, and settled on the porch with his head on my boot. He didn't want to go far, and I didn't ask him to. The only place he needed to be was here. The following week, Dr. Warren came for a house visit. He checked Rusty gently, hands kind, voice soft. "He's tired," he said. "No pain, just tired. He's had a full life." I nodded, throat thick. The fullest. Rusty gave the doctor a slow lick on the hand before resting his head again. That evening, the sunset stretched out long and golden, casting the yard in that gentle kind of light you wish you could hold. Rusty lay between me and Shadow, his eyes half closed, breathing slow. And in the quiet, I spoke. You changed everything, you know, just by being you. He didn't need to respond. He had already said everything he ever needed to. When I woke the next morning, he was gone. There was no sound, no struggle, just peace. He lay where the sun would hit first, as if he'd chosen his final rest with care. Shadow sat beside him, head bowed. I wrapped him in the blanket he'd had since the beginning, the one that came with him from under that canoe, and buried him beneath the oak tree in the yard. Dale came by and helped dig. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say. I carved a simple marker. Just his name, Rusty, and the dates. But underneath, I added a line from one of the letters we'd received months earlier. He reminded us that love can be quiet and still change the world. The days after were tender. Shadow paced more. He searched the house in the early mornings, checked the porch at dusk. I let him. I did it too. People showed up. Neighbors dropped off flowers. A dozen children from the reading program sent cards, each one with a drawing of Rusty and a book. Evelyn came by with Bean and Scout, who lay in the yard like they understood. Tom brought Tank and Pebble and sat on the porch without speaking for a long time. The loving pause site flooded with messages. Hundreds, maybe thousands. People sharing what Rusty had meant to them. Some had never met him in person. Some had only seen pictures. But it didn't matter. His story had touched them. And now, it was theirs too. Shadow stayed close. Closer than ever. He took over the porch spot, watching the street the way Rusty used to. He followed me from room to room, not anxiously, just faithfully. And when I finally opened Rusty's old blanket chest to put away his things, Shadow climbed inside and fell asleep on top of them. I left the lid open. Time moved forward. Not fast, not easy, but forward. A month later, I got a call from the trauma recovery center we'd visited early on. They'd started a new program, therapy visits with animals trained for quiet companionship. They asked if Shadow could come by. I looked over at him, curled on the rug, ears twitching at the sound of my voice. "You ready for this?" He lifted his head, tail thumping once. The visit went well, better than well. Shadow sat beside a man who hadn't spoken in weeks. The man stroked his back and whispered, "You feel like someone I knew." He did. He felt like Rusty. But he was also his own. Back at home, I wrote one more entry for the site. This started with one dog and one plastic bag. A single act of care. He gave everything to protect what mattered. And in doing so, he showed us what really matters. Quiet love, fierce loyalty, and the courage to stay soft in a hard world. Rusty is gone now, but he left something behind. A ripple, a legacy, a light. And that light still shines. In every child who finds confidence in a story. In every person who decides to start again. In every dog who gets a second chance. And in Shadow, who is ready now to carry the torch. We go forward, not alone, never alone. Shadow climbed onto the porch that night and settled beside the empty spot where Rusty used to sleep. The stars came out, one by one. and together we watched them shine.